Hello, everybody. My name is Sergio Araneda. I am a research scientist at Cavion and an independent consultant. And today I am going to, I am rehearsing the presentation I'm going to give on Thursday this week about the emerging challenges that AI is creating for educational testing and credentialing. And I want to talk today about well, originally I have a different topic, slightly the same, but not exactly what I'm going to present today. The title of what I'm going to present today is The Multiple Crises of Validity Theory in the Age of AI. I will do a short introduction to some of the work I've been doing with philosophy of technology and validity to introduce some vocabulary. And then I will explain like a few crises that are happening, in my opinion, in validity theory driven by AI, that are kind of deep. I mean, hopefully my presentation today gives you food of thought to think about validity in a more deeper way, in a deeper way. Maybe what I'm going to speak today is not going to be too obviously related to operational work, but still I believe that they are like deep forces moving around that we should be aware of. And because they can actually mean important transformations for the future. And yeah, I wanted to talk about this. So AI is really disrupting multiple aspects of what we do in educational testing. I will focus today particularly in validity theory and how AI and validity theory are interacting and how AI is kind of like creating multiple situations there. I've been writing a lot about this idea of test as socio-technical artifacts. This is an idea coming from philosophy of technology, and uh, this is like a relatively new branch of philosophy that they worry and think about more specifically about how technology works and the idea of function, for example, of an artifact, etc. What is an artifact? So when I started to read more about that literature, I realized that there were so many connections to testing and to validity theory in particular. And I started to write a few papers making these connections. So these are kind of at least three preprints I've been publishing in the last 2 years about these interactions on the idea of seeing tests as a socio-technical artifact, which is a concept coming from philosophy of technology, and how that relates to validity theory. This way of thinking actually makes a lot of sense when you also think about AI, because AI is a technology, it's a very important technology. Testing is also a form of technology. Both are interacting. When you have this framework in mind, you can start to see certain things in a different way. So part of the presentation today is to bring you, like lend you for a second these lenses to start to see these things that, in my opinion, are happening in relationship with AI and validity. So, as an introduction to this also technical way of thinking about testing, when you think about validity theory, you see this historical at this point historical contention between a realist point of view and a more constructionist or yeah, constructionist way of thinking about validity, in which one is saying that there is something real in the world that doesn't depend on your mind. Tests are valid, like the object of test is the one that has the property of being valid or not, and what I call the Dutch school about validity theory, that actually is very closer to psychological testing, and conceives that a test is valid for measuring an attribute if the attribute exceeds and variations of the attribute causally produce variations in the measured outcomes. It's a causal view about validity and is ontological in the sense that it requires like a condition of existence. Ontological means or relates to things that, or the philosophical part of what are things that exist or don't exist. On the other side, you have the American school. And in the last chapter of validity, in the educational measurement book, Lane and Marion, they define validity as the extent to which theory and evidence support or refutes proposed and actual or enacted tests, score interpretations, uses, and consequences. It's a richer definition. It considers multiple things, theory, evidence, this idea of test score interpretation, uses, and consequences. validity is residing as a property of those and not necessarily about the test, because it is understood that if you change the interpretation or the use of a test, then you need to do validity work again. You cannot kind of like attribute some function to a test for different uses, etc. And the standards also have a very similar definition. The chapter from Lane and Marion, they highlight certain differences with the standard, but in essence, they also consider interpretation and uses. This wording about like for proposed uses or and uses, etc., but still within the same constructionist mindset. On the other side, philosophy of technology, they define certain vocabulary that I like a lot and is very helpful. So I read this book from Peter Cross that's called Technical Artifact, Creations of Mind and Matter. That is specific on philosophy of technology and has a very specific way of thinking about function attribution. So that's probably the main reach there on testing and this literature of philosophy of technology. And when they speak about artifacts, they define different uh, they have different definitions for what is an artifact. So you have artifacts that are object with a purpose. Then you have technical artifacts that they have a purpose that is more specific and it has like a forness. So the purpose is to do something with this object. And then you have socio-technical artifacts, which are artifact that has a forness, but also is like relying and depending on societal systems to accomplish the function. So, for example, a hammer is a technical artifact because it's made to do the action of hammering, of like having certain to pin down nails. The social technical artifact, for example, would be a plane. A plane is an artifact, is technical, but also requires a lot of societal things to work. And another very important concept from this philosophy is this idea of separation between what they call function attribution and function ascription. So function attribution is when you have a goal in mind, this forness, this verb that you want to execute with this artifact, and is embedded in the design of the artifact. You design the object from the beginning having that goal. Function ascription is when you put a function into an object that is already existing and you change the way it is being used. So for example, a screwdriver is an object that has a very intentional design for it. But you can use eventually a red knife to also screw drives, certain type of drives at least, in certain contexts. But that doesn't necessarily change the nature of the object that you're having, this red knife. So in the literature of philosophy of technology, you see these cycles of function attribution and ascription, in which you have technologies that are designed for certain purpose, but then are repurposed for other things. Cross distinguishes three stages like kind proper, use accidental, and use proper. And for each, there are like definitions of what does it mean to have these functional properties of being kind proper, use accidental, or use proper. And these definitions match very well with this idea of testing because the definition that work for technologies in general can be applied to this idea of testing. And particularly not just test, but C measurers, like an object to measure a construct C. And I kind of like translated those definitions into definitions related to testing. And this is probably the most important one, the ontological version of the kind proper condition for having this kind proper functional property, which is that C measurer is a C measurer if it is a result of a largely successful execution of a largely correct design aimed at measuring construct C. This is a definition that is ontological in nature, but is not necessarily causal. And this idea of ontology of the artifact kinds that we create and this idea that when you have a test and when you use the expression a test is valid, doesn't necessarily mean that you are saying that it's valid for everything, but you want to know at least if the test is a test. So that is the meaning of the more casual use of this word, that something is valid. But that doesn't deny and doesn't force other, or no, doesn't impose this idea that you cannot do function ascription. If you're doing function ascription, then you need to validate a different use plan and also all of that, and there are conditions for doing that. So all the philosophy handles in a very interesting way this dichotomy false dichotomy up to a certain point between the realist and the constructionist, because they are basically talking about different functional properties. One is functional attribution, one is functional ascription. And each of them have their own space and they have their own relevance. And also philosophy of technology showing that for an ontological point of view, you don't need to enter into a causal way of thinking. There are ways in which you can still be ontological without necessarily being causal. Okay, so about the multiple crises that I'm going to finally talk now. In my opinion, AI is creating multiple crises. AI as a technology, when you bring this idea of the kind proper, use accident, produce proper, is in this stage in which we are finding use accidental ways of doing, like putting our function there, like ascribing function to something that maybe is not designed to do, like creating items, scoring essays, doing stuff, but institutionalizing and making it quote unquote proper. But then eventually we needed to create like specific new tools designed from the beginning with that mindset. In that cycle of like technology creation, I see certain crises happening for validity theory. The first one is the ontological crisis. So probably the summary of this crisis, in my opinion, is that the conditions to say that something is a test are changing. And the objects that are within the realm of validity theory are also kind of like crumbling. I don't think we have paid enough attention about the question of what is a test. Multiple authors worry about like how do you call that interpretation, a use, a test, whatever is valid, but what is the object? And how do you define that this object is the object within our jurisdiction, if you want? And is it only one type of technology? Is there multiple? Now we are seeing all this variety of things that are actually not really resembling what we usually understand as a test. And the word test also is kind of like inaccurate in multiple ways. You have also an ontological crisis, or sorry, an anthropological crisis, because the very sense of what does it mean to be human is affected by AI. And also this idea of like what is intelligence, what is artificial intelligence versus human intelligence, how artificial intelligence is mimicking human intelligence. There is a book from Donna Haraway called the Cyber Manifesto, and that's a very interesting piece of literature to read because this idea of like the symbiotic relationship we have with technology always has been there. But now with AI, it's becoming so much important. And it's becoming important to the point that our sense of what does it mean to be human is changing. And what is relevant for validity theory is that usually the construct definitions of what the construct, the type of construct that we care of are depending in this implicit view of what does it mean to be human. So if you change that, it's very likely that also you are going to change the scope and realm and approach you have about construct in general. There is a socio-technical crisis, in my opinion. This is related to the institutions that govern these technologies that we call test. Here, in this case, the standard, for example, are a very example of this socio-technical layer in the technology of testing. And the problem is that now we are not having necessarily like a socio-technical layer, like institutions and devices related that are properly used or kind properly constructed and designed. It's more like accidentally repurpose some previous stuff into the world of AI, into the use of AI and governing that, but more in an accidental way and not necessarily in an intentional and design way. The institution is behind this technology, and that's the crisis I'm mentioning. And this is relevant for validity theory in the sense that the parameters of under we understand the practice of validity are somehow behind, and probably they will need to change in important ways because of AI. There is an epistemological crisis, in my opinion, as well, in the sense that um, the way in which machine learning works is very about predicting things, and that's the golden standard to say like this machine is working. But we come from that. That's the current way of thinking about validity, and that's very unfortunate that because AI is so popular, we are kind of like coming back to that way of thinking and forgetting why that was a bad idea. So when you see this like obsession with predictability of things, it's important to remember that that is very similar and has a similar problem to the problem that we had when we thought that validity was a correlation without criterion. That's an epistemological crisis that I believe is happening. And lastly, this is like probably the one most serious crisis here, the sociological crisis. I will borrow language from philosophy of politics, or political philosophy, sorry. And this idea of the social contract, like the Rousseau social contract, let's speak about the assessment contract. What are the unsaid expectations about what does it mean to be assessed? How do you do that, etc.? AI is tearing apart that contract. The expectation of how you are going to be assessed now is so different. AI is making most of the or multiple form of testing optional, de facto optional. So it is a very important change from a sociological point of view. And I think that will have some repercussions in validity theory as well, because it's weird that you can have some validity theory that is not coherent with what is happening in society, and particularly with this idea of the assessment contract. That is the actual substrate of, if you want, of what you do in testing. I don't have much time. I will need to just jump here, but these are the crises that I foresee. There are a few actions that you can do, some references here. And the slides are going to be my personal website in the section conferences. Sorry for taking extra time here. Thank you very much.